We're joined now, though, at the Boston Public Library by GBH's Philip Martin and Meg Woolhouse. Philip is the senior investigative reporter for the GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting. Meg is editor of Education, the Education Unit at GBH News, and they're here to discuss, I guess I would call it a deep resistance to diversity in, of all places, Newton, Massachusetts. It's great to see you both. Fabulous reporting. We're glad you're here.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much for coming in. Really
here.
appreciate it. So, Philip, let's start with you. What is happening in Newton?
Well, what's happening in Newton is actually something that's happening around the country. There's a sort of a pushback, if you will, a backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion. That notion and that policy that gained traction after the death of George Floyd in 2020, it's been around for a long time, but a lot of people began adapting DEI after the death of George Floyd, including in Newton, where about 500 alumni of the Newton Public Schools signed a letter that year, 2020, asking that the city of Newton and its schools do more to make Black, Latino, Asian students feel more welcome within its schools. And this effort to push back DEI gained traction around that same period, but particularly in the context of COVID, as grades started to suffer, as test scores started to suffer. There was people were looking for an answer. Why? Obviously, COVID was part of that answer, but they said it had to be something more. And so a group of parents decided that more had to be diversity, equity, and inclusion.
By the way, so at COVID, the test score declined, Meg, but also they had the audacity to add the word racial to their mission statement in the public schools, not just equity, but racial equity. That apparently was triggering for some of these parents too, yes?
Right. Can you believe it? But when you try to talk to some of these parents about these issues in an overt way through an interview, they consistently go back to discussing how academics in the community has declined over and over again. And so through some really excellent reporting by my colleague Philip, we had emails and exchanges from parents groups where they specifically talked about diversity, equity, and inclusion programs as being responsible for these declines. And just to quote from one of the emails, if you don't mind, Newton schools are intentionally and explicitly putting a divisive view of race relations into every aspect of the curriculum. And then they go on to say, teachers are being trained to make lessons more relevant by teaching about white supremacy.
Wait a second. The first half is to make it more relevant, and that's a criticism?
Yes.
Of what the teachers are. Who are these people, Philip? I mean,
well, they've come under various names. The latest being Improve NPS, Improve Newton Public Schools, and it's important for us to state that not all parents who are concerned about academic decline militate against DEI in Newton. The school superintendent, Anna Nolan, has made this clear.
She's new, right?
She's new, and it's very clear in our research and our reporting that not all of these parents fit into one basket. But some do. Some, a small number do in fact see DEI as tantamount to non-quality or an erosion of quality, and have reached out to groups like FAIR. FAIR is a group called the Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. It's an innocuous-sounding name, but they largely are right-leaning. It's a group funded initially by Harlan Crow, the same individual who, of course, funded Clarence Thomas's various vacation
adventures
and escapades and so on and so forth. And that was a red flag. Harlan Crow has traditionally funded far-right organizations. And though FAIR posits itself as a group that does not tolerate intolerance from the right or the left, it's largely its goals largely are aimed at affirmative action and DEI.
You know, when I read your work, your collaborative work, I always hope when I'm reading it that it's going to be these marginal nutbags who are doing these kind of things. I know that's not your term, it is mine. But I hate to single this person out, but it's somebody I've heard a lot about through the years. One of the people who's attended some, I think, FAIR meetings is Jeffrey Flyer, who is the former dean of Harvard Medical School. Do we know what is prompting him to be part of this thing?
Well, he's had a lifelong affiliation with, or a career-long affiliation with some groups like the Heterodox Society.
What's
and
that?
sometimes he takes, I think it's like a libertarian-leaning group, and he takes sort of these, controversial positions on issues. And he's done that, I think, at Harvard by asking them to re-examine some of their diversity efforts on campus. So he also is part of a group of parents in the group that don't have children in the system.
Oh, I didn't know that.
But want to weigh in heavily on what the Newton Public Schools should be doing. And I just note that a number of the people that we talked to...
The prominent guy or woman, I don't know, Janie Finkelstein, is that a man or a woman? I'm not sure.
It's a woman.
It's a woman. Yeah, she doesn't have her kids in the public schools either.
That's right.
So
That's right. And you
awfully
find that
upset.
again and again.
Well, so like book banners, don't read the book, just take the position. I'm sorry, Phil.
And they had also reached out for advice. This core group had reached out for advice to a woman named Ashley Jacobs, who says straight up, and there's no obfuscation, that equity and equality, or rather equity and excellence don't go hand in hand. It's impossible. She says they basically, it's impossible to have equity and excellence.
By the way, she's quoted in your piece. That's not
right.
rhetoric on
that's
a
right.
conclusion you're
she
drawing.
Says that.
She says it.
Yeah. And we should also point out that a group, she's part of a group called Parents Unite, private school parents who basically push back against equity efforts after, again, the summer of 2020. And one of those one of the people who's trying to basically improve the public schools, who has basically not only heralded DEI, but has pushed back against neo-Confederacy at Newton Public Schools in small numbers, group of students who were flying the Confederate flag when he first arrived in 2016. He's also pushing back against anti-Semitism. This is the principal, Henry Turner.
He's gotten death threats.
He's gotten death threats. That's right. Because once his name was put out there by FAIR and a group called Parents Defending Education, a Virginia-based right-wing so-called parents group. A lot of these so-called parents groups emerged again after the summer of 2020, both George Floyd and COVID. He received death threats, but he has also been pushing back against them and has been very working hard to include this multiracial, multi-ethnic group of parents and students in pushing toward equity and excellence within the Newton.
I want to just stay on this for
Newton
1
North.
second. Another example of where you disagree with a public official's position. We talk about it in Congress all the time, in the speaker's race most recently, and the language of that debate is threats, if not actual violence, perpetrated against an individual who's taking a principled position, even if you disagree. What's his full name, just so people know?
His name is Henry Turner.
Henry
the
Turner.
principal of Newton North High School.
North.
That's right.
Do you know, we talked yesterday about Newton in a different context. Do you remember, Jim?
I do. Leaf blowers.
70% of the people in Newton had landscapers, and they were using those gas leaf blowers, and they were driving each other absolutely insane. I don't know if there's a connection
No,
here
there's
between
no
the
connection.
gas blowers
There's no
and
connection,
the whole thing. But I do wonder, Meg Wilhouse, where does METCO fit in to this whole discussion? Because METCO is a program, very successful program, well, at least in some people's estimation, where kids from Boston go to schools in Brookline, Newton, Cambridge, Wellesley. Well, I don't know if they're going to Cambridge, Wellesley, et cetera. Where's that? Kids of color.
Well, I think we do know that METCO's expanding a bit, and I think that the effect on students of color is terrible. I think that they feel threatened. I think that Henry Turner has pointed out that he feels upset on behalf of his students because they're forced to learn in this climate where they're getting a lot of hate.
And of course, it's also important to point out that not all the black and Latino students at Newton North or Newton South or any of the other or the middle schools are METCO students. There's not a significant black population in Newton, but there's a black population in Newton.
I wondered. Do we know how big the black population is in Newton?
It's fairly small. It's less than 5%.
Yeah.
But
They had a black mayor not too long ago, Seti Warren.
that's
Oh, I
right.
know.
Seti Warren now
Didn't
at
he run for
Harvard
governor?
Kennedy School.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So, Philip, starting with you, let's get to what I consider the better part of the story, is the other side, people who actually believe in DEI and tolerance, racial tolerance, are fighting back. Yes?
That's right.
What are they doing?
Well, there are a number of groups, but one that some of the parents we interviewed belong to something called Newton Upstanders. And they basically, when they first saw, for example, the invitation from FAIR, or from parents in Newton to come to a FAIR gathering, they were a bit mystified by the language. Again, a group calling itself a group against intolerance and racism. But yet the language seemed to suggest that they were also anti-DEI. And so this group formed...
Jeffrey Flyer was there, by the way.
He was.
That's right, Jeffrey Flyer was there. So they essentially formed this group to basically protect, if you will, not only DEI, but also to push back against any number of isms, including anti-Semitism within the schools, and also to bring in a larger group of parents into their orbit. And so they are a multiracial, multi-ethnic group that also embraces LGBTQ rights. If you remember, there was a pushback against LGBTQ plus students last spring after Newton North held their annual LGBTQ day. Some people said they should not be happening in the schools. And
Really?
so groups of parents and students demonstrated on the Cambridge Common in support of this because a anti-LGBTQ group, again, many of them non-parents, had decided to hold a demonstration against them. But the counter-demonstration was much larger.
Well, that's good.
This happened last May.
You know, can I ask a selfish question? I'm doing a program, actually interviewing Keith Lockhart, a Newton resident, for an organization, a wonderful organization involved in the arts called Newton Community Pride. Last year, you remember this, I did Nancy Shern, who is the brilliant
right. Yeah, the
activist,
make way
sculptor,
for ducklings.
make way for
Yeah,
just
sculptor. She's
terrific.
a neat lady.
A lot of the public officials in town are showing up at this thing. Where are they? The mayor, the state senator? Where are these leaders? Are they leading on this issue?
Well, let me put it this way. The school committee...
That sounds like a no. It makes me nervous. Let me put it this way. Put it this way, Philip.
We have to assume they're being very careful, but the school committee itself voted unanimously against a parents' advisory committee that Newton Improved NPS was attempting to create that would have advised the school committee advice that they necessarily did not want.
This is the anti-DEI people.
These are the anti-DEI people who petitioned this year, to create a parents' advisory committee. And they held a very well-attended meeting, the school committee, about 400 people, an emergency meeting on March 28th. And at that meeting, these groups of parents who believe that academic excellence is on the decline in Newton, but also believe that DEI may be the culprit, they went before the microphone and attempted to make their case. Some of their arguments were well-reasoned. Almost no one mentioned DEI in their comments, but most of the parents who were there opposing this felt that they were, in fact, implicitly targeting DEI.
And I'll also note that...
the school committee voted against this parents' advisory committee unanimously. Sorry, Meg.
That's right. No, and other communities have these parent advisory groups. There's one that exists in Dedham.
That's right.
Where the woman is running
correct?
for a school committee, and she's been on the wrong side of this, from my opinion anyway, and she's a long-time activist all around town. Are you going to say something?
You're right. I think we have to recognize that all around the country, this is happening everywhere.
Yeah.
Some places you have stealth candidates who are running whose allegiances are to extremist groups like Moms for Liberty, which the Southern Poverty Law Center has described as extremist, as a hate group. Parents Defending Education is described as a hate group, as an extremist group. And so in the Northeast, it's hard to run explicitly and directly tied to these groups. But in places like Florida, under the governorship of DeSantis, people run with pride as Moms for Liberty candidates or Parents Defending Education. And so in Massachusetts, you have an interesting situation, interesting dynamic, where they're trying to run more or less as stealth candidates. Now, we haven't seen this in Newton, but we have seen it, as you pointed out, Marjorie, in other communities around Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Well, a stealth candidate, like the new speaker, says he loves old people.
He's pro-human.
He is and human hearts, of course. Can I ask?
Okay.
In your reporting, you quote some Harvard professor who's an expert in education saying, yes, it is true that fewer kids in Newton are taking AP classes, which obviously is a concern. If I were a parent in Newton, I'd have that concern too. But he said it's not related to DEI. What is it related to if it's not DEI? Is it the after effect of COVID? I mean, what is the conventional wisdom, Meg Wilhouse?
Well, I mean, it's a really good question, I think, because we went to, I think a lot of the inroads that groups like Philip outlined make into communities are by getting parents whipped up about educational standards slipping. Parents are thinking, I just spent $1 gajillion on a house. I want to live in Newton, right? And what you're telling me now that the academics have slipped? But what's really going on is people in the community are using that as a bit of an inroad to spread, ideas about programming that has no scientific, no correlation to reality. So what we did was we went to Martin West, who's on the State Board of Education. Right, yeah. Also, it's so funny because you reach out to people for interviews and they're like, well, I live in Newton. It happens all the time, right?
Yeah.
Martin West lives in Newton. He's a dean at Harvard, and he crunched the numbers to look at AP scores, and he found that, yes, there has been a decline in Newton over the last decade in AP scores. But that has no connection to DEI. And he was very clear saying there's nothing that points to DEI as the problem.
Speaking of Martin West, so here's a quiz for the two of you. I hope I get this right. What city, I think it's in America, but at least in Massachusetts, has more Nobel Prize winners living there than any other city? Go ahead.
Should we say Newton?
Newton, ding, ding, ding. That is the answer to the question. Talk about useless trivia. So, Philip, what's next here? Is this the defeat of the slate, the end of this, or what now?
It's likely not the end of this. I should also point out that one of the other changes that occurred in the school was tracking. Tracking has always been problematic.
Explain what that is, please.
Well, tracking basically is a way of slotting students into areas where it's assumed they belong intellectually or in terms of their potential. And a lot of this occurs in elementary schools and middle schools. And so Newton has changed its tracking, creating a more equitable a plane, if you will, for students going into various classes and so on and so forth, students of various abilities. And a lot of folks have pushed back against the changes in tracking, though there have been efforts for years, decades, to try to change tracking. And you asked what's next, Jim.
Because it's discriminatory.
Because it's discriminatory. That's right.
Yeah.
That's very important to point out. And what's next? I think there are several things that might be happening. We should look at what the upcoming school committee election to see, because it's not clear what everyone's position is. Who's
is
buying.
That this week or is that
that's
next year?
That's this coming
this week.
That's right.
Okay.
The school committee might be a determinant of how parents are reacting to this and in terms of who they're supporting and so on and so forth. We should also look at the various school councils at Newton North and Newton South. A lot of the Upstanders were voted onto this council, but we'll see what happens in the future. And we also have to see what is happening nationally. Again, efforts by groups like Parents Defending Education to make inroads in Massachusetts. Newton, they have not succeeded that well, though they continue to receive so-called incident reports about, and what they call incident reports are reports that where people support DEI or support LGBTQ rights in the schools. And so these incident reports have been filed in Lexington, in Dover, in Brookline, in Wellesley. Again, relatively liberal suburbs.
Yeah, and all alleging this reverse racism in whatever capacity, in school theater productions or in clubs and groups that kids want to join, and maybe they want to have an affinity group.
That's right. And that's a really important point that Meg just pointed out. Khalil Mohammed, who is also a professor at Harvard, has pointed out that a lot of these groups who use these language that seem innocuous, that this is not a new effort. This is, again, another effort to make inroads into liberal communities by using language that people can accept.
Does Khalil Muhammad live in Newton too?
That's a good question.
You guys did
Does he have a
fabulous
gas
work on
leaf
this, in all
blower? That's what we have to find out, really. They're a
Huge
menace, Jim.
contribution. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank you
so
very
Appreciate
much,
it.
both of you, for coming
Thank
in.
you. It's really
Appreciate
great.
it.
Thanks for
We've
having
been
us.
speaking
Thank
with
you.
GBH Senior Executive Reporter Philip Martin and Education Desk Editor Meg Woolhouse. Thanks again to both of you for coming in.